Good morning, everyone, and thank you for tuning in for another episode of Coffee and Something Stronger. My name is Cody Norrid, Executive Director of Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. Coffee and Something Stronger is a coffee chat style interview show where we sit down with practitioners, faith leaders, academics, and talk about the intersections of faith, climate, environmental justice, and the other justice issues of our time. And this morning we have on a good friend and a fellow IPLer, Ken Winston, who is the Director of Policy and Outreach at Nebraska Interfaith Power and Light. Ken, thanks for being here this morning.
Thanks, Cody. It's good to be here today. I'm glad I could join you.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do and how you got into that work?
Sure. Well, I've got a fairly long history of working on environmental issues. I'm an attorney by background, and I originally, when I got out of law school many years ago, I worked for the legislature for many years. And then after I left the legislature as a staff person, I started working as a private attorney and then got a job lobbying for the Sierra Club in 2002. And that role with the Sierra Club grew over the years from 2002 to 2015. I represented the Sierra Club as a lobbyist, and then in 2010, I was hired to work as a campaign representative against the Keystone Pipeline. And then in 2012, I also worked for the Sierra Club for the Beyond Coal campaign. And in 2015, President Obama denied the Keystone permit. And so at that time, I went to work for a state senator who was an environmental champion, and I worked for him for a year and a half. And then when he was in term limited in 2017, I had been on the board of Nebraska IPL from 2013 to 2017. And so in 2017, when after I was no longer employed by the legislature, Nebraska IPL was looking for a staff person. And so I applied for that job and became the Director of Policy and Outreach, although I think my job encompasses more than that. And anyway, I cover lots of different aspects and wear lots of different hats. One of the other things that I've also done, since the Nebraska IPL job is not a full-time position, I've also represented the Sierra Club and Bold, Nebraska against the Keystone Pipeline after Trump revived the permit in 2017, and so represented them in legal proceedings. And then more recently, I've been working as an organizer for the Nebraska Sierra Club in the community of Lincoln, in addition to my Nebraska IPL work. So do lots of different things and have lots of different opportunities to engage in outreach and help connect people with the earth and their fundamental beliefs.
Yeah, you've been doing a lot of work for a long time, and obviously the Keystone Pipeline is something that we're going to dig into in a little bit, but I wanted to give you a chance to offer your reading before we dive in here.
Sure. And this is something I always like to start with, which is just to say that to ask a fundamental blessing that may the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in the sight of the Creator of all things. Now, I'd like to begin by just, as I said, I like to be fairly simple and fundamental. This morning, it's very cold here in Nebraska. It's about 0 degrees out, so most people are not enjoying being outside. But one of the things I'm always reminded of is how beautiful the earth is. And so I just wanted to read the first verse and chorus of the old hymn, For the Beauty of the Earth. For the beauty of the earth, for the beauty of the skies, for the love from which our birth over and around us lies. Lord of all, to thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise. All right.
And what about that hymn kind of speaks to you, and why do you keep going back to it?
Um, I think it's one of those things that, as I said, I think one of the fundamental things that I think is important is to connect people both with where their heart lies, and and also with me, just to acknowledge the beauties and the bounties of the earth. I mean, uh, I guess I'm also moved by passages from Scripture, such as the 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 uh, the verse from Matthew where Jesus says to the disciples, "Consider the lilies of the field," and so just to remind us that the the beauties of the earth and how we're sustained by them, and how we always need to be mindful of them, and how they can strengthen and nourish us, as well as the being strengthened and nourished by our faith traditions and by our faith itself.
Yeah. Could you say a little bit about your kind of what your religious background is and what theological tools you're kind of bringing from your tradition to do this work?
Sure. Well, I'm currently a member of a UCC church, First Plymouth Church in Lincoln. I grew up in a Lutheran household, but to me, as I grew older, the the faith that I grew up in felt too dogmatic, and the the message of the United Church of Christ of being more open and accepting was a lot more in line with what resonated with me. Um, However, as I often like to say and remind people, I'm not theologically trained. I've sung in a church choir for many years, so all my theology is secondhand. And so, um, but I do think it's important. I think just connecting with simple fundamental truths or things that resonate with people. Um, I really feel like that's important in terms of having a message that people will accept and will motivate them to engage and take action.
Yeah. No, that's great. I mean, really theological training and lawyers can get pretty close, Ken. So
Yeah, we probably don't want to go there.
yeah, that's for a different show.
Well,
Um,
well, it also, um, I think sometimes it is important to get into the weeds, as it were, and really delve into all of the depths of things. But sometimes the deepest things, um, it's like looking into a clear pond that you can see all the way to the bottom.
mm,
Uh, Sometimes that's what you need, as opposed to something that's heavy and thick and murky. Um,
right.
so anyway, that's
Speaking
my
of murky things, the big reason that you're here is we wanted to talk about the victory over the Keystone Pipeline and something that should be celebrated far and wide. And I know something that you and your colleagues have been working on for a long time. And so, for people who are tuning into this show who have not been kind of on the front lines of working on that pipeline, could you talk about what the Keystone Pipeline is and what the threat that it poses is in pipelines generally?
Sure. Well, how many hours do you have? No. uh, I mean, I'm being a little bit facetious, but there's a lot to cover.
Yeah.
Well, uh, just to begin with, when I first started working against the Keystone Pipeline, it was in 2010, and at that point, I didn't know much about that pipeline or pipelines in general, and so I just met up with some people who were opposed to it, and one of the key things, and one of the reasons why I think that people should really celebrate this victory, is the fact that we were supposed to lose. There was absolutely no way that a few environmentalists and a few farmers and ranchers were going to defeat this thing. And because you had the entire fossil fuel industry, which of course has billions of dollars for that they can spend on lobbyists and on advertising and on message makers and on contributions to politicians and I mean just vast financial resources. So I was working for the Sierra Club at that time. So this is 2010, and uh, there were a couple of things that stood out in the battle. One was that uh, we were able to build common bonds with people who ordinarily would not have had relationships with one another. One of the well, I mean, first of all, there were lots of Republican ranchers who never would have had anything to do with the guy from the. I remember one guy always used to say, call it the Sahara Club. Anyway, I don't never like that Sahara Club all that much, but you're okay. So it was one of the things he'd say. And so the Sierra Club it worked. I mean, one of the good things about the Sierra Club is that they did have uh, it was a brand name, it was well known, and so there was that. Also, the Sierra Club works on many levels, so that they worked locally, they lobbied the legislature, and in both cases, I mean, by saying they, I mean me, but so there's local organizing, local outreach, lobbying the legislature, um, and also they work nationally, uh, lobbying Congress and working with Congress and people on the federal level. So
Sure.
and also they engage in litigation. So they were working on multi levels. So that was a really important factor. But one of the other, and probably the the thing, the strangest of bedfellows, were the partnerships between Native Americans and farmers and ranchers who had historically been opponents. And the fact that I remember hearing one rancher say to a Native American, um, so I know I'm beginning to understand how the Indians feel about being pushed around by the government. And so there was what came to be called the Cowboy and Indian Alliance. And I think I still have some stickers. I don't know if I still have them or not. This just came to mind. So if I don't find them quickly, I won't bother with it. Well, anyway, the sticker shows, um, I've got one stuck to the inside of my folder here, but it just shows they call themselves the CIA, the Cowboy Indian Alliance, and the sticker it says CIA, and it has a photograph of a pair of boots and a pair of moccasins, and so it brought together uh, people who've been dispossessed and the ancestors of the people who had dispossessed them to form a bond and build a relationship, and and so that was a very powerful. That became a powerful alliance in itself. But there are also people of all different walks of life. I mean, there was a group that called themselves the Grandmother's Apple Pie Brigade, and they would bake cookies and take them to the governor's office, and they would sit outside the governor's office and ask if they could, or actually they would, both the governor's office and the governor's mansion, and they would say, would you take these in with this note telling the governor that he needs to call a special session of the legislature. Uh, and then there were just lots of demonstrations that we did on lots of different levels. Yeah. And so bringing lots of different people from different backgrounds together.
Yeah. So you've talked a lot about how kind of the community organizing efforts and a bunch of partnerships help to stand against the pipeline. But could you also talk a little bit about, so what is the Keystone Pipeline and what was it going to do? And, what were some of the dangers facing Nebraskan communities and Native communities?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. I get I get
That's quite
going,
all
I
right.
just start going down the road and get off on a detour. The Keystone Pipeline, well, there is another Keystone Pipeline, but this is the Keystone XL pipeline, which we decided meant extra leaky. But there were lots of threats, and first of all, the fundamental aspect of this pipeline and the pipelines that come from Canada is that they transmit tar sands oil. This is not oil that is pumped out of the ground. It has to be scraped out of the ground. So what they have to do in order to get it, there's a forested area in Alberta and British Columbia, mostly in Alberta and Canada, um, called the boreal forest, which provides habitat for all kinds of wildlife, and also provides a carbon sink. But anyway, they clear cut the forest, and then they dig up. They have to mine it, basically strip mine, and dig all this. Basically, it's sandy soil that has oil in it, and then they have to cook it, cook the oil out of it. But when there's still sand in it after they finished, and it's still too sludgy for it to be transmitted by an ordinary pipeline or in an ordinary pipeline. So what they have to do is they have to add what are known as diluents, which are to dilute it, and then it has to be transmitted under high pressure and at high temperature. So first of all, as I said, the devastation of the boreal forest and the process of getting it out of the ground and converting it into semi-liquid substance, that in itself is an environmental travesty. And and the native tribes, the indigenous people of Canada, have rallied against this for years and years, and it's still a horrible environmental injustice that's continuing to happen in Canada, and it's one that we need to continue to push back against. So that just in itself is a bad thing. But then the way that they want to shove it across the country is because of the fact that it's also a huge pipeline. It would have been 36 inches in diameter, which is, wow, 3 feet across. I mean, well, you can't see my, but anyway.
It's no small pipe that we're talking about.
Yes, it's huge, and it's also under very high pressure. So these tend to leak, and so the first pipeline leaked a lot in the first couple of years, and that was one of the other talking points that TransCanada had, was that this is going to be the safest pipeline that had ever been built, and yet it continued to leak. And there was one situation where a farmer came out of his house and saw a geyser of oil spouting into the air, and went and called 911 or whomever. And of course, TransCanada claimed that, well, their sensors had detected the leak, but it's unclear whether they detected it or whether he did. But anyway, and then one of the other risks for Nebraska is the fact that a big part of the central part of the state, there's what is known as the Ogallala Aquifer, which is the largest freshwater aquifer in the North American continent. And the bulk of it is in the state of Nebraska. And it's really, you have water in this aquifer that's thousands of years old. And it's in some places, the aquifer itself goes several hundred feet beneath the ground. Wow. And also, most places, streams are fed by rainwater or snowmelt. In many places in Nebraska, the streams that exist are in north and central Nebraska. The streams are fed by the aquifer, by water coming through the aquifer and being fed by springs into the streams. So, and another factor of this is the fact that the aquifer in this area is covered by porous soils, by sandy soils. And so if there were a leak, if it did leak, it would be very likely that it would contaminate a lot more water. It would be more likely to contaminate water and more likely to contaminate more water than under an ordinary aquifer. But the other thing about it is that it's incredibly difficult to clean up an aquifer. Basically, if an aquifer becomes contaminated, you just basically kind of try to contain the contamination. And so getting the contaminants out of there. And then, as I mentioned, the substances that were used to dilute the tar sands are extremely toxic. They're substances like toluene. I can't even think, but anyway, toxic carcinogenic substances that you would not want to have in your backyard. And then the idea that they were going to be taking farmers and ranchers' land through eminent domain proceedings if they didn't want to have it. Well, nobody likes eminent domain, and that was a key thing that we played on. In addition, they were going to be going through traditional native lands, even if, well, TransCanada did take steps to avoid going over reservation lands, but many of these lands were in areas where the tribes still have claims. And one other factor that was key in all of this was the fact that the pipeline would cross the Trail of Tears, which is where there was forced relocation of the Ponca tribe in the late 19th century from Nebraska to Oklahoma, and that's known as the Trail of Tears. And there are some sacred sites along that trail, and so there are many factors involved. But as I've often said, the pipeline it was just bad in every respect. Oh, one more thing. This is also important. Major greenhouse gas emitter, and of course fossil fuels are major greenhouse gas emitters in any event. But the process of getting this oil out of the earth and creating it generates a great deal more greenhouse gases than just oil that they pump right out of the ground.
Sure.
So bad on every level.
Yeah, I mean, even before the process gets started, you essentially destroy a land sink by deforesting. Then you use a bunch of energy to get it out of the ground and then push it across the country at a high speed and a high temperature. I mean, incredibly polluting before the oil from that pipeline even gets used.
Yes, and well, one of the other things that it was also that played in our favor was the fact that TransCanada lied constantly. I mean, they just well, the whole campaign, and this is a big Republican talking point even now, that it would create, well, thousands of jobs. I mean, I remember being in a debate with a guy, and the debate was it was live stream. It was I think it was on the radio. Anyway, but anyway, it was a debate with a TransCanada representative, and the number of jobs grew by threefold in the course of the interview. I mean, when the subject was first raised, it was, the guy was claiming, I think, 6,000 jobs, and by the end of the interview, he was claiming 20,000 jobs. So it's like, they couldn't even keep their story straight. But there was no evidence that pipelines create huge numbers.
Yeah.
As we often said, the only way to create that many jobs would be if they were busy cleaning up oil spills all the time.
Well, luckily, this pipeline isn't continuing, and you have beat it in a number of different ways. And you talked a little bit about the groups who organized against it and how you kind of got there. But this final order came down about the permit pretty recently, and now could you kind of talk to us about what that means, and then what does it mean going forward for the work in Nebraska and this pipeline?
Well, I guess one other thing I wanted to talk about, since
Sure.
we're talking about interfaith this is an interfaith power and light event. There were lots of different spiritual traditions that were involved in this. And I remember at one hearing there was a guy who identified as being Jewish, and he was immediately preceded by a fellow who identified himself as Muslim. And then there were several Protestant pastors and a Catholic priest, and then at least half a dozen Native American spiritual leaders who spoke. And so the fact that there was I think the spiritual aspect of this was an important part of it. The fact that people's spirits were united and they used their own spiritual traditions and spiritual messages to sustain them. And I think one of the things that I've taken away from it was the message from indigenous people that when they speak of land and water as being sacred, it's not a matter of speech. It's not a figure of speech. It's a reality. There's a true belief of a sacred connection with the land and the water, and then in kind of a secular connection to spirituality, I often said that TransCanada may have had the money, but we had the artists and the poets and the musicians on our side. So that was, I guess, I think that's an important part. And as you said earlier, it's important for us to celebrate this, that it is a big victory.
It turns out that if you organize and you keep fighting, sometimes you can win fights that you weren't supposed to win.
Exactly.
Yeah. Hey, well, could you say, you beat me to it because I was going to ask you about this. We're getting kind of close to time, but I wanted to ask you about, I'd heard you present on this before, and you had said that same phrase that they had the money, but we had the artists and the poets and the singers. And I know you yourself are a musician, but I wonder if you could speak to kind of it seems like you're suggesting the power of creativity in this and the power of artists and activism. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that and how it played out there and kind of the importance of that.
Sure. And there were lots of different aspects of it. I remember one day in I think it was August of 2011, where we had events all over Nebraska where there were poetry readings and musical performances. And there was a group of people, I think they're from Nigeria, and their name is called Ogoni. And they put on an event because they wanted to show solidarity for the fight against the pipeline, because they'd had to deal with fossil fuel companies in their part of the world. But just the fact that there was creativity, that imagination, there were things that captured people's spirit and or rather than capturing it, it set people's spirits free and help people understand that the power that they possess within themselves, and it's kind of the same power that you get from singing in a choir, of finding your voice and in harmony with other people's voices, and discovering the power of voices singing together, and learning that there's sometimes when you have to be in the background and help create harmony, and then there's other times when you have to step out in front and as John Lewis said, you have to create trouble. You have to create good trouble, and if you're not making people mad, you're not doing, as one of the Frank Lemare, who's a Native American activist who's since passed on, would often say, if you're not making people mad, you're not doing your job. And so yeah, just the way that spirituality and creativity and the arts can help feed people's souls and energize them and help carry them through times when they're dealing with big challenges. And I mean, and in the same way that it has done in lots of battles where people have felt that they had little chance of winning.
Yeah. Well, Ken, thank you for coming on and sharing about your experience and the work that you're doing there. I mean, it's great work. And again, it's a huge victory. And I think a testament to the interfaith organizing that's gone on in Nebraska as a part of this fight.
Well, thanks, Cody. It's great being on. Looking forward to when we can get together again and
Absolutely.
doing some music ourselves.
Absolutely. Well, may we try to join that choir and make some good trouble and do our jobs and maybe make some people mad in the process. So,
well, thanks, Cody, and
yeah, thank you.
Blessings on your day.
Thanks, everybody. You can catch us next week, same time, same place, for another episode of Coffee and Something Stronger.